What's the deal with Russia? Why did Russia invade Ukraine, but not Estonia, Latvia or Lithuania? They were all once part of the Soviet Union. They all sit close to Russia's border. So what makes Ukraine different? What's Putin's motive? The answer starts with a simple four-letter word: NATO. But before we dive into that, let's rewind. Russia's war in Ukraine didn't start in 2022. It really began in 2014 when Ukrainians overthrew their pro-Russian president and made a sharp turn toward the west. Russia responded by annexing Crimea and backing separatist militias in the east. So, what is Crimea? Crimea is a peninsula in the Black Sea with huge strategic value. It's home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet and gives access to warm water naval routes. Russia seized it in 2014, quickly and without much resistance, claiming it was historically Russian territory. But Crimea is part of Ukraine under international law. The annexation wasn't recognized by most of the world and triggered sanctions and outrage. Now let's zoom out even further. For much of the 20th century, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, from 1922 until it collapsed in 1991. Before that, it had been dominated by both the Russian Empire and Poland, depending on the region. But when the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine finally gained independence, peacefully through a referendum. Over 90% of Ukrainians voted to break away, including a majority in Crimea. At first, Russia tolerated this, but as Ukraine grew closer to Europe, tensions rose. Russia began to see Ukraine not just as a neighbor, but as a battleground for influence. So while Ukraine may have shared deep cultural and historical links with Russia, it also had its own language, identity, and aspirations. And the more it leaned west, the more uncomfortable Moscow became. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? Firstly, Putin doesn't see Ukraine as fully independent. In his speeches, he claims Ukraine is historically Russian and should never have separated. He sees its independence as a mistake of history, a glitch in the post-Soviet world order that must be corrected. Second, NATO expansion. After the Cold War, more and more countries joined NATO, moving closer to Russia's borders. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Baltics, all signed up. But Ukraine was still up for grabs. Putin viewed Ukraine joining NATO as a red line. Once it's in the alliance, there's no going back. He wanted to stop that from happening, permanently. Third, Ukraine's pro-democracy movement posed a threat to Russia's own system. A successful, Western-leaning Ukraine could inspire Russians to question their own authoritarian regime. That's dangerous for Putin. Fourth, there's the strategic prize: Crimea, the Black Sea Fleet, fertile farmland, industrial infrastructure. Ukraine isn't just symbolic, it's valuable. Finally, there is domestic politics. Nothing distracts from internal problems like a foreign war. With Russia's economy stagnant and dissent rising, war offers a rallying cry. Russia under siege, unite behind the flag. Why not the Baltics? So if Russia wants to reclaim lost territory and influence, why not go after Estonia, Latvia or Lithuania? Because those countries are members of NATO, and that changes everything. NATO, short for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a military alliance formed in 1949 to prevent exactly this kind of aggression. Its central promise is simple: an attack on one member is an attack on all. That's Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause. It's only been invoked once, after the 9/11 attacks on the US. If Russia attacked Latvia, it wouldn't just face Latvia. It would face the United States, the UK, France, Germany, and every other NATO member, including 3 nuclear powers. That's a war Russia knows it can't win. Ukraine, on the other hand, is not a NATO member. It's in what geopoliticians call a gray zone, caught between East and West, vulnerable, isolated, exposed. That's the difference. Why hasn't Ukraine joined NATO? But why hasn't Ukraine just joined NATO to protect itself? The truth is, it's complicated. Ukraine has wanted to join NATO for years. In fact, its constitution was amended in 2019 to make NATO membership a national goal. But there are 3 big reasons why it hasn't happened. 1. Ongoing conflict. NATO has a rule: new members must not have active territorial disputes or wars. Since 2014, Ukraine has been locked in a frozen conflict in the east and lost control of Crimea, making it ineligible under NATO's own criteria. 2. Fear of escalation. Some NATO countries, especially in Western Europe, worry that admitting Ukraine could trigger a direct war with Russia. That would activate Article 5 and drag the whole alliance into the fight. So instead of fast-tracking Ukraine, NATO has provided weapons, training, and political support, but no formal membership. 3. Internal challenges. Before the war, Ukraine still struggled with corruption and political instability. NATO has strict standards for governance, military transparency, and rule of law. While Ukraine was making progress, some members believed it wasn't ready yet. So for now, Ukraine remains NATO's closest non-member partner, getting military aid and attending high-level meetings, but without the full protection of Article 5. And that gray zone, not quite in NATO, not fully out, is exactly what made Ukraine vulnerable in the first place. What is NATO really? NATO isn't just a military club. It's a security umbrella, a diplomatic alliance, and a deterrent force rolled into one. It started after World War II, when Western countries feared the spread of Soviet communism. They formed NATO to ensure that if the USSR attacked one of them, it would face them all. Over time, NATO expanded, and that expansion angered Russia. To the West, NATO is a defensive alliance. It doesn't conquer territory or impose regimes. It protects its members and promotes stability. To Russia, NATO looks like an advancing enemy, swallowing up neighbors, stationing troops, and backing revolutions, especially when those revolutions happen in countries like Ukraine. But here's the key point. NATO membership is voluntary. Countries join because they want protection, not because NATO forces them in. And lately, more countries than ever are knocking on NATO's door, including Sweden and Finland, who joined after Russia invaded Ukraine. Ironically, Russia's war has strengthened NATO, not weakened it. Final thoughts. So here's the full picture. Most ordinary Russians aren't bloodthirsty. They're misinformed, silenced, afraid, or simply trying to survive. In an authoritarian state, silence often looks like support. But underneath the surface, cracks are forming. Among young people, conscripts' families, and those who've lost loved ones in a war they never truly understood. Most Russians do not grow up hating Ukrainians. In fact, before the war, they often saw them as brotherly people, culturally close, speaking similar languages. But that makes the propaganda even more effective. It tells Russians that Ukraine has been hijacked by Nazis and needs to be saved. The emotional logic goes, we're not fighting Ukrainians, we're fighting the people who took Ukraine away from us. Russia invaded Ukraine because it saw a chance to reassert control, block NATO, and dominate a country it sees as historically Russian. It hasn't touched the Baltics because they wear NATO's armor. This war is about more than territory. It's about power, identity, and the future of Europe. In one corner, an authoritarian regime trying to rewrite the map. In the other, a network of alliances built on collective defense. And stuck in the middle, Ukraine, a nation fighting to choose its own path. Please do us a favor by liking this video and subscribe to Versus Vault for more cool topics. See you in the next video.